vitamin D versus sunshine.
Yeah. And I wrote a whole paper for the Western Price Foundation.
Brilliant paper. Everybody should read it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been really intrigued by this. You know, it's interesting how the doctors finally figured out that we have a major epidemic in vitamin D deficiency in this country. They figured that out maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, and when you look at, like I think we even looked at the number of people who were diagnosed with vitamin D deficiency over time from some data set that we had, and it went astronomically up over a short period of time. That's because they suddenly started looking for it. You know, it had been building up, the deficiency problem, but once they started looking for it, more and more people started looking for it.
But isn't there a problem with the test that you can't necessarily diagnose a deficiency based on just a 25-OHD test?
Right. Well, it's complicated, right? Because it gets the liver, so it's made in the skin in response to sunlight, and then it's shipped to the liver where it gets the first step that gets the first hydroxy. It's 1,25 hydroxy, right? Is the final product that is the active one, and the 25 hydroxy is the one that's intermediate. That's the one the liver makes, and then the kidneys do another step to make the 125. And then the 125 is the one that's actually active and signals all kinds of things. What you measure is the 25, which is the one the liver makes. Now, I will tell you that the liver and the kidneys make these modified vitamin D molecules from enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, CYP enzymes. And papers have shown that glyphosate suppresses CYP enzyme activity in the liver. So one of the things I think is happening is simply that the vitamin D is not getting activated because the liver CYP enzymes are broken.
So an inactivated vitamin D is a dysfunctional or non-functional vitamin D. And so
exactly.
Everything to do with hormone regulation and absorption of calcium and deposition of calcium doesn't work properly because you don't have the, quote, active form of the vitamin D.
Right. And the thing is calcium. So vitamin D, one of the things it does is it mobilizes calcium. So anytime anything in the cell is saying, hey, we need calcium, vitamin D is going to say, here, you can have tons of it. You know, it's just like, here you go, lots of calcium.
Yeah.
And so when the body is sick because of the glyphosate has been shown in multiple studies to induce calcium uptake by cells. It induces calcium uptake. So now when you've got all this vitamin D that you're taking as a supplement, you're encouraging that calcium uptake. So this is calcium uptake into the artery wall to produce calcified plaque.
Right.
Calcified arteries are bad news. That is a very bad risk factor for heart disease.
Yeah.
So you're taking vitamin D, which is helping you to increase the calcification of your arteries, which is not a good thing, you know?
As well as potentially being, well, not potentially, being exposed to a chemical that also at the same time is increasing the uptake and probably the deposition of calcium into the tissues.
Yeah, and also when you eat, those people are taking tons of vitamin D. So when you take tons of vitamin D orally, it hits the liver, and the liver is stuck either having to turn it into some, you know, use the CYP enzyme to do its thing, or use that CYP enzyme to do other things that it needs to do, such as making bile acid. So when the liver is busy trying to convert all this vitamin D, it can't, its CYP enzymes are not as available to make the bile acid. So that could actually interfere with the bile acid production, which glyphosate already interferes with it because it disrupts those CYP enzymes.
Right. And I remember, you know, there was an old saying amongst European physicians that the bile cures the bowels. In other words, the reason you have bowel movements and the reason your bowel movements are healthy is essentially because of bile flow. So if you have somebody who's glyphosate toxic or injured or exposed, they already have bowel problems. And then if you add vitamin D onto that, they will make less bile, which will make their bowels even worse. And
that's what I would predict. Yeah. Really crazy. I think it's just insane that people are taking these huge doses of vitamin D. There seems to be no limit. I mean, it used to be that doctors would recommend, you know, something much, much more reasonable as a supplementary level. Now they're going like 10,000 units, 20,000 units. I mean, it's crazy. It's out of sight. It's just ridiculous to think you would need that much. And the other thing is, of course, when the skin makes vitamin D, it also makes cholesterol sulfate. So when you take vitamin D as a supplement, you're not taking cholesterol sulfate. If you eat a food that contains vitamin D, it also contains cholesterol sulfate.
Right.
So vitamin D comes with cholesterol sulfate, and to some extent, it's a signaling molecule that says, hey, you've got cholesterol sulfate, but you don't because you're taking it in isolation. So it's lying to you. And that can really mess up your cells because they're acting on false information.
So then you have confused cells. And again, one of the repercussions you might see is this abnormal calcium deposition, which is everything from gallstones and kidney stones and
Exactly.
artery deposition. And, you know, I think 80, I don't know how many percent of the people have calcified pineal glands and
Exactly. It's really going into all kinds of terrible places, and it's to being extracted from the bones because your signaling is saying we need the calcium in the tissues. Let's take it out of the bones. So your bones are actually becoming worse, not better. At the same time, you're stealing it from the bones and putting it into the tissues.
Right.
Which is really bad.
So many people may be hearing this, and I think they may be thinking to themselves, so is Stephanie saying that I don't think taking vitamin D is a good idea?
I've never taken it. I've never taken it as a supplement, but I'm obsessed with sunlight. I have really high vitamin D levels in my blood. So, you know, I have a healthy level of vitamin D. 60, I think, is what.
Do you think there's any justification in anybody taking vitamin D as a supplement?
Personally speaking, I would say no. I certainly wouldn't take it. Yeah.
So really, what about in the winter and people who live in Massachusetts, for instance?
I know. That's actually where I start to think, I don't know if I can keep on telling these people not to take vitamin D. Of course, I'm lucky. I go to Hawaii in the winter, so I make sure I get plenty of sun. Not everybody can afford to go to Hawaii in the winter. So, and then people ask me, well, should I use a sun lamp, you know, sort of like a full spectrum sun lamp in the winter? And I hesitate there too, because, you know, those things can cause skin cancer. So I think if I were stuck in a place where there wasn't a lot of sun in the winter, first of all, I would stock up as much as possible in the summer, try to get a really good tan, because you can store it, you know. You can.
Right. Isn't there some logic in thinking, first of all, it's fat soluble, so it's going to be stored. And there must be something adaptive about human beings and probably other animals, you know, going through a cycle of storing it, you know, making sure they're replete, and then maybe there's something good about having less in the winter.
It could very well be that we've adapted, right? People who live up north have adapted to this cycle that they get a lot of vitamin D in the summer, and then they have to store it for the winter, and then they come back out, you know, in the spring and pick it up again. Yeah. And also you can get it from foods. I don't like to get it from vitamin D supplemented foods. I've seen orange juice supplemented with vitamin D, and if I see that, I won't buy it. Yeah. It's ridiculous to put vitamin D in orange juice. And they put it in milk.
Any truth in like if you eat, since vitamin D is fat soluble, and if you have a pig, for instance, that's out in the sunlight all summer and spring and maybe fall,
yes,
they would likely have more vitamin D in their fat, i.e.
That's right. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and we use organic lard mainly for cooking, you know, for frying foods. Organic lard, that's our favorite fat.
Yeah,
butter is probably
you mean like pasture raised.
Yeah, well, organic lard. It's hard to find, but there is a company that sells it on the web. So it's
and so that is an organic vitamin D supplement.
Say it again.
That would be almost like a vitamin.
Yeah, exactly. So I would eat foods that contain vitamin D in the winter. So bacon and lard. Use lard in cooking, and probably eggs and milk if you could get raw milk. Raw milk would be great. Of course, they destroy the vitamin D in the milk, and then they add back in, I think they add in vitamin D2, which is ridiculous because D3 is what you need.
Right.
I don't like milk because it's so processed, you know.
Right. So we don't want any. So we're only looking for, obviously, if the animal isn't out in the sun, it's not going to do any good. So we want animals in the sun, eating their natural food, whatever that animal happens to be, and they will store vitamin D in their fat, and that's the part that we want to eat.
Right. So grass-fed beef, for example, the fat of grass-fed beef. So that you can use that as well. The beef tallow, I think it's called, right?